Hello and welcome back. My name is Dr. Christopher Gennari, and this is the Great Big History Podcast. In this episode, we're talking about the Roman army. The Roman army is the Legion, Legion, which is the name of the formation, but ends up becoming synonymous with, especially in the Bible, with many, it becomes a non-specific number. But a legion was about 5,000 men, and it was an independent unit. It was like each legion was its own army on the move. So you could see how in the ancient world this worked. You could put a bunch of legions together, but the idea was a legion should be able to conduct its own military affairs on its own. Now, Romans will fight with a sword and a shield. Now, there are auxiliaries that will fight with lighter weapons, javelins. They'll throw. Occasionally, you'll have some bowmen. You'll also have nobility on horseback, but the cavalry is never that important, much to Roman detriment in places like the Middle East. The Romans will lose a bunch of battles because they don't have very good cavalry. They will hire cavalry, especially Nubian light cavalry. That's African, black African troops from Africa who were very good horsemen. These are men who could ride their horses across the Sahara. And no good Roman general after, the 200s would go off without at least some Nubian cavalry to help just reconnoiter around. Again, remember Natio. So we have a 5,000-man unit, kind of like a division today, the way divisions would have been or thought about today. And they use a sword and a shield. Now, what is the effect of that? The effect is, and if you're on the video, you can kind of see, the effect is it spreads people out. You can't be in a phalanx with a sword. Your shield also has to protect you. You are on your own. There is space on your right side and space on your left side. Advantage is mobility. You can back up. You could go forward. You could turn to the right. You could turn to the left. You can leave. You could just head back up the row. If you've ever been in a classroom where you're in rows, that's a legion. That's the legion. So that everybody can get in and get out. That's the way the legion works. If you're in my lecture hall, like Madison 210, or a concert hall, that's a phalanx where everyone is squished together in the middle. And there's a couple of aisles between more people being squished together in giant boxes. So if you've ever gone to see a play in Philly or Broadway, you'll see phalanxes. They're divided into three if there's one in the middle, one on the left, one on the right. Or there might be 5 or 6, depending if they break the ones in the middle in half with a walkway. The legion, on the other hand, is spaced to your right and to your left, so that you can maneuver. So the advantage is, gives you space, allows for flexibility. Disadvantage, it's much easier to run. It's easy to run away. And so these are people who are going to need more training. They're going to have to want to stand where they are. No one can help them. They have to defend themselves. They have to be a military unit unto themselves. Whereas the Greek phalanx, the guys in the middle didn't know anything about war, and that was okay. They can participate. They could be important. In a Roman legion, that doesn't work. You have to know. You have to be prepared. You have to have training. So you need training and discipline. And the Romans will have harsh discipline. A unit that runs away gets decimated. Means 1 out of every 10 or random people are executed as cowards. There is a lot of harsh The training itself was what fathers did with sons. Since every son was eventually going to have to be in the military, father's job was to teach him how to spar, how to use a shield, how to use a sword. The advantage is it gave flexibility. And the other advantage is it's interchangeable. Any Roman unit is supposed to be as good as any Roman unit. The Marines work like this today. The idea that every Marine is a rifleman. That's the idea that every Marine can do the basic job of being a Marine. And they could do it equally well as any other Marine. You could rely on any legion to be as good as any other legion. Now, will there become, over a long period of time, elite legions that will do things that other legions aren't asked to do? Yes. And this will be especially true in the Roman Empire. When you have an emperor, he'll create like super legions, because most legions are on the border just kind of hanging out. So they're training and they're good, but they're not the elite one that moves with the emperor. He'll have the best bodyguards. He'll have the best legions with him. Patricians and plebeians served. Patricians, the rich people, were the officers, and plebeians were the infantry. Plebeians are the middle class to poor people. It's the idea that everybody served. And in fact, when patricians wanted to get elected, it was not unusual for them to go into public squares, stripped down to their underwear, or less, and say, "Look at me. Vote for me." And the idea was, you could see their scars. And they would say, "I got this scar with you. I got this other scar. I got this scar at Zama. I got this scar in Spain. I got this scar at New Carthage. Just like you." The idea was everybody served. You couldn't get into the Senate unless you were in the military for 10 years. You couldn't even try to be elected. And so what this shows, why this is important, is this was the relationship in society. Rich people told poor people what to do in society. They then went into the military, where rich people, officers, told poor people, infantry, what to do. And then they left the military, and rich people told poor people what to do. And now that sounds sucky for poor people, but it also gave you protections. It also gave you a relationship with rich people. When a patrician went off to war, his plebeians might go with him. People who worked on his farms, people who had his support or his patronage, because poor people always need money. And so a patrician was always there to give out money or food or services, legal services especially, protections. And so you had this relationship in society. So the army reflected society, which is very different from American society. In American society, that doesn't happen. In American society, we have been at war for nearly 20 years at this point, continuously, and less than 1% of Americans have served. So you don't have those strong bonds in society. In fact, there are plenty of books that talk about the opposite of going from the military, where you lived a lifestyle, a military lifestyle, where you were told what to do, what to eat, when to sleep, how to sleep. And then you get into society and you're surrounded by people, none of whom obey that ideas. None of them have that kind of discipline. And so the idea is that unlike our society, in the Roman society reflected the military, and the military reflected the society. So that officers, patricians had this respect in society, in the military, back into society. But plebeians also had those protections. I have had plenty of officers in my 20 years of teaching, in the 20 years of war we've had. And my question to them has always been, if one of your men knocked on your door and said, "I need help," would you help them? If one of your men's kids 12-year-old daughter knocked on your thing. Private first class Smith's daughter knocked on your door and said, I don't know what to do. Can you help me? My father's in trouble. I'm in trouble. Would you help them? And every officer I've had in my class, and I haven't had high officers, I've just had the non-coms and captains and a couple lieutenants, and they have all said the same thing. Of course I would help them. Of course, without thinking twice about it. That relationship was true in the Roman society, and that bolstered the society. It gave strength to the society. As a poor person, as a plebeian, you had protections. You always had your officer. You always had your patrician that you could rely on to help you. Because their legitimacy was based on that. They can't be an officer if no one likes them, if no one supports them. They can't be a successful patrician if their plebeians don't like them, won't support them, won't vote for them. So you have this reinforcement of society, of responsibilities and protections. Victory was shared glory. Everyone in the unit got it. Everyone in the military got it. A triumph, which is the highest elevation of the group, and for the general, the individual, was a parade through Rome as the Romans threw out flowers as you walked, but the entire army walked through it. They all got to share. The men got bonuses from their patricians for it, because what the patricians got was glory. They got to say, I won a war, I got this, and then they spent like drunken sailors to thank their men. Caesar gave out unbelievable amounts of money to his men. I think it was like a year, 2 years worth of pay. Like imagine getting like $100,000 as a bonus and then getting a parade. We still do this, right? If when the Phillies or the Eagles won their championships, we had a parade, right? We call it, a ticker tape parade. I'm from New York, so it was a ticker tape parade because you would dice up ticker tape and throw it out. We don't do that anymore. But the idea was a triumph is the highest elevation you can get, and you shared it. Everyone who was in the war, everyone who shared in the final victory shared that glory and shared that pride of that glory. So they got to say, I was at Zama. I was at New Carthage. I was at Artemisia. I won victories. Defeat equaled raising more legions. If you were dumb enough to defeat a Roman legion, to wipe it out, the Romans raised more. There's no better version of this, explanation of this than Cannae in 6. Cannae is in 216 BC. It is Hannibal, Hannibals, Hannibal of Carthage, greatest victory. It is one of the greatest victories any general has ever won, ever. Now, Hannibal had already crushed 2 Roman armies. His army was smaller by a third of the Roman army. And in one day, he obliterated the largest Roman army ever put together in one place at one time, ever. 70,000 men were butchered. He lured them into a trap. He surrounded them. Now, you have to understand, in military history, a smaller army cannot surround a larger army. The larger army has more men. They could spread out further. So smaller armies are always worried about being surrounded by larger armies. This was Robert E. Lee's worry against Grant. Grant always had more men, significantly more men. So Lee's problem was getting surrounded. That if he got surrounded, it was all over. So he's constantly backing up through Virginia. So this can't militarily happen, and yet it did. Hannibal does it. He lures the Romans into a trap, surrounds them. There's one estimate that 800 men a minute were being killed, were being butchered. They were packed so close like sardines, but even closer than sardines, that you couldn't breathe, that people were being crushed to death. 70,000 men in one day. What does Rome do? It doesn't give up. It should have given up. If it had been any other society, that defeat is the end. It's the end of the society. Hannibal goes to Rome and kind of plants his flag and goes, I'm here. I won. Are we done yet? He had killed 10% of all Roman men in like 3 months. The butchery was so bad that Rome made crying illegal. Publicly crying illegal, because so many people had lost family members that if one person started weeping in public, the worry was everybody would, and it would just destroy the society's morale. This is the keep calm and carry on, the beginning of that kind of idea. And what does Rome do? Raises more men, creates more legions. Rome will raise 1 million more men over the next 20 years and put them into the army. 1 million. Nobody else could do this. Nobody else. The Greek world could maybe put 100,000 men into the army if they hired everybody who could hold a sword and to be a mercenary. The Romans could put 1 million men into the field because of Natio. So the idea is they may lose battles, and the Romans will lose battles. Remember that sword and shield. Remember that they're ordinary patricians and plebeians. This is not a warrior society. This is like a bunch of reserves, National Guardsmen going out to battle, especially in the early Republic. They have some experience with weapons. They're not great with them. And so there will be times when they run into expert armies and get destroyed. They may lose battles, but the Romans fight wars. They will win the wars. So what is the effect of this? War all the time for 300 years. The Romans will fight and slowly conquer Italy. They'll beat up their neighbors, the Latins, various different peoples. One of the hardest are the Samnites, who lived in the Apennines, who lived in the mountains. They took a long time to defeat. Eventually, they will defeat the Gauls, and then they'll defeat the Greeks in the south. Defeating the Gauls, they had to learn bravery. They had to learn toughness. The first time the Romans ever saw a Roman attack, they ran. The entire army just threw down their weapons and ran, and the Gauls just laughed at them. Ho, 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 ho. They had to learn how to stand and fight. To fight these guys who were bigger than they were, who were tougher than they were, who were taller than they were. To defeat the Greeks, though, you needed to learn tactics, strategy. You could not run into a Greek phalanx. Again, the best example of this is Pyrrhus. P-Y-R-H-U-S. P-Y-Y-R-H-U-S. Pyrrhus, where we get the word Pyrrhic victory from. Pyrrhus is brought in from Greece, from Albania, with a Greek army, this is a generation after Alexander has died, to defend southern Italy and Sicily from the Romans. He's brought in as a mercenary, brings in his Macedonian Greek army, and he wins. He's one of the only guys to have a 100% victory record against the Romans. He won. He defeats the Romans every time he fights them. But the victory in destroying those Roman legions is so costly that in the end, he's like, if I keep fighting like this, I'll have no army left. I got to go home. I got to rebuild an army. I got to get my stuff back together back in Greece. I got other things to do than keep doing this. And that's why we get Pyrrhic victory. It's where you win, but it costs you so much. You treat it like a defeat. It's almost like a defeat. So there's a moment that's interesting where two great generals, Hannibal and Scipio, are supposed to be having a drink. I want to say it's in Egypt. They're both ambassadors. Hannibal has been defeated and has run away, has gone to Egypt to in asylum. Basically, he's trying to find himself an army in the Greek East that he can bring west to beat up on the Romans, excuse me. And Scipio is an ambassador to the Egyptians. Now remember, Egypt is still the richest place on earth, so richest country on earth. And they had fought each other. They had fought each other in Africa. They're the two most famous men of their day. And they sit down and they're having a drink. And Scipio goes, Hannibal, who are the greatest generals to ever live? And Scipio and Hannibal goes, well, there's Alexander. And of course, Scipio says, of course, yeah, that goes without saying. He's the GOAT. He's the greatest of all time. We got that. Who's next? Hannibal goes, well, I would put me next and Pyrrhus third. And Scipio nods and goes, that's interesting. Because us Romans sent Pyrrhus home. And I defeated you. And Hannibal's like, yeah. But it wasn't the same. You didn't defeat me in Italy. And Scipio's like, no, that's true. I didn't defeat you in Italy, but I did defeat you. And so there's this like, ha thing going. And it's a great scene. I want to say it's out of Plutarch, because Plutarch has these great scenes. But the idea is to destroy a Greek army. You can't run at it. Those spears will just stab you and kill you. You had to surround it. You had to pull it out of its defensive posture. You had to get it out of the mountains. You had to learn tactics and strategy. You had to get smarter. Defeating the Gauls made them braver. Defeating the Greeks made them smarter. Because you had to think, how am I going to beat these guys? How am I going to defeat them? I can't just stand here and whack away. They'll stab me with their 20-foot long spears. And then it's over. And so over 300 years, this is very important, the Romans change. The Romans are willing to change. And that's huge, because most societies don't change in the ancient world. Most societies are very conservative. If it worked, we keep doing it. So the idea that the Romans are willing to change tells you just how they feel about their world, that they are so under threat of invasion that they have to change. To not change, to not innovate, to not evolve is to be destroyed. It is very much a Darwinian idea. Those who change succeed. Those who don't are destroyed. And so what the Romans do is absorb Italy. They create Italia. They create Italy. They absorb the Latins, the Etruscans, the Greeks, and eventually the Gauls into a united Italia, into a united Italy. And then they bring in Nascio, and that will tie these new people to them. They become Roman. And as wars go on, especially the war with Carthage, the Romans, now there's a period of time between this and the wars with Carthage where the Romans are like, well, I don't know about making you Romans. And then after the war with Carthage, which demands 1 million men, 2 million men to fight in it, the Romans basically say, okay, you're Roman, you're Roman. And that's huge, because when Hannibal shows up in Italy, he expects to free all those people beat up by the Romans. He expects them all to join him as mercenaries. And he gets some, but most don't. Most will actually fight for Rome, because Hannibal had nothing to offer. He had freedom. That's all. You could go back to the way things were. Well, the way things were terrible. That you were constantly fighting your neighbors, hoping not to be butchered. What the Romans brought was peace. And we'll talk about that in the Roman Empire. But neighbors stopped fighting neighbors. And the Romans said, you can sell your stuff in Rome. You're a Roman. We'll give you the rights to vote. We'll include you. And so what the Romans offered was a bigger world that people were seduced by. Whereas Hannibal offered freedom, but in a small world, in a tiny world, where you were still on your own. And in the end, people chose what Rome offered. So that's going to bring us to the situation in about 260 BC, where you have Rome controlling Italy. Carthage, which is started as one corporate mercantile city, through a system of alliances and trade negotiations and some good war, controls Spain, North Africa, and Sicily. There's a kingdom in Macedonia, which controls Greece, Macedon, and Ionia. There's Ptolemaic Egypt. There's a Greek kingdom in Egypt that owns Egypt, the Levant, Jerusalem, and some of the islands, Cyprus, Crete. And there's the Seleucids, who control Asia Minor, parts of Asia Minor anyway, Mesopotamia, and in theory Persia, all the way to Iran, but this all the way to India, excuse me. But this world is so big and so hard to travel that effectively they controlled Syria and Mesopotamia, but not really had control in Asia Minor or in Iran. Basically, the local people had much more control. Local governors had a lot more control in the far-flung pieces. In Syria and in Mesopotamia, they had good control. But outside of that, the farther you got from that core Babylonian land that we've been talking about forever, more and more governors did whatever they wanted. So this brings us to the Punic Wars, the wars that will change Rome. And we're going to talk about them and the effects in our next episode. Thank you.